So hi and welcome to Bias Uncovered. My name is Crystal, and for those of you who met me earlier today, one thing I didn't actually mention is that although I work in user experience design, my academic background is actually in economics. And specifically within economics, most of what I studied was related to a field of behavioral science. So behavioral economics emerged sort of at the intersection of economics and psychology. And one key assumption in classical economic theory is that people act rationally and in their own best interests. So a couple of economists and psychologists got together and thought, well, what if we ran some experiments and try to find instances where people didn't act rationally or didn't act in their own best interests? This has been written up a little bit in, the media. Some of the most common examples are, when you have a bargaining game and you give two participants a chance to split up that money, and sometimes people, don't take the money because they are upset that someone else split it up in sort of an unfair way. In that sense, they actually walk away with no money when they could have walked away with some money. So it's a little bit irrational or not really in their own best interests, and it really reveals a lot about human behavior. So what I plan to cover today are a couple examples of behavioral science out in the world around us, also in technology products, and then also when it comes to organizational behavior. I'll talk about three cognitive biases and psychological phenomena in general: the anchoring bias, the confirmation bias, and social proof. And if we have time at the end, hopefully, we'll have some time for questions. So the first thing I want to cover is a bias known as the anchoring bias. Now, this is what happens when people tend to rely on the first piece of information offered. So a good example of this, just that I think everyone can relate to, is you walk into a store and you see something that's on sale, and it's 50% off, so you buy it thinking, wow, that was such a great deal. And then you go home and you look at it and you're like, wait, I don't know if I'll ever wear this. Maybe this was a bad idea. Why did I even buy this in the first place? It's because we get a little bit caught up on the fact that, wow, this is 50% off the original price. It's such a good deal. I have to get it. Well, that price was made up by someone anyway, right? And that's a prime example of anchoring bias. But I actually want to tell you a little bit more about a couple of experiments that were related to anchoring bias. And I think from this we can learn a little bit about the implications for sort of the organizations that we work in and the way that we make decisions. So this was a study that was done by a professor. He did the study where he offered a couple options to a group of students. So this is what the first group of students saw. There are 3 subscription options for a magazine. You can get the digital edition, you can get the print edition, or you can get the print and web edition. You can see the prices up here, but one thing you might notice, as I did when I first saw this, is that there's the same price for the print edition and the print and web edition. And if you look at that and you're always hunting for a good deal, you might think, wow, that's pretty nice. It's like you're getting the digital subscription for free. So in another condition of the experiment, a group of students saw only 2 options. So they saw the first, the digital edition, and they also saw the print and web edition. And this is kind of interesting because what they found in terms of what the students chose really mattered based on what options were available to them. So when there were 3 options, first of all, nobody chose the middle option, only the print edition, right? I mean, if you could get the digital edition for free, why not? So the vast majority of people chose the last option, the most expensive one, because they thought, wow, that's kind of a good deal. I'm getting both for sort of the price of one. So if someone were in an organization to say, well, if no one's choosing this option, why offer it at all? And they remove the second option completely, then something interesting happened. More people actually chose just the digital edition. They just chose the cheapest option. And so I think what this really shows is that we don't always make decisions just based on the raw price. We make it in comparison to all the available options to us. And if you were, say, an executive at this magazine, you might want to optimize for overall revenue. You might as well maybe just keep that second option there, if only because it sort of encourages people to choose a little bit differently. It encourages them to choose a path that is sort of in the best interest for the business. Another example of anchoring bias actually comes, it's a little similar, but it takes the example of beer. So say you're going to a bar, you're going with a group of your friends, and there's two options for beer on the menu. There's a cheaper option and there's a more expensive option. In most cases, people tend to choose the more expensive option. Now, let's say the person who's running this brewery decides to add a third option. They can either add an option of beer that is cheaper than the cheaper option, or one that is more expensive than the more expensive option. And what actually happens in this case when you run this experiment, this is from a book that was written by someone named William Poundstone, is that in both scenarios, most people choose the option that's in the middle. And their hypothesis for why people behave this way is because people don't want to look too cheap when they're like going out to drink with their friends, but they also don't want to look like they're too picky, like they have to have the best beer on the menu. So they sort of put themselves most of the time somewhere in the middle. And this is, I guess, assuming this is someone who doesn't care that much about the difference between the beer, and this is mostly just looking at the price. So if you were the person who owns this brewery, you might want to run some of these experiments to see how it affects consumer behavior. So the anchoring bias matters a lot because it impacts the way that we price our products. It impacts the way that menus are designed. So sometimes in menus, you can see there's some items on the menu that are highlighted, there's maybe a picture, there's a box around it. Those are typically the kinds of items on the menu that have a much larger margin for the restaurant. But people look at that and their eyes are drawn to it, and it really sort of encourages people to order that. It also, if you're working in software as a service, it can affect your sales strategy. If you're working in retail, it can affect your discount strategy. And I think maybe an example that hits a little bit home to everyone is that it also has a huge impact for salary negotiation. So my key takeaways for you is that if you're working in a software company and you do offer different pricing tiers, especially if you're at a startup, experiment with a couple of those different tiers. See how different items on the menu change the way that people choose, especially if you're working on maybe a smaller margin consumer software product. And if you're in the process of applying to a job and you're talking to a recruiter, I would say that different people have different recommendations, but consult someone who's an expert, and there's a lot of resources online. But in general, I could say that if you've done your research and you know the market for the salary pretty well, you could consider offering a number first. That way you're setting the anchor, and that every future conversation is around that anchor. Make sure you say a number that's higher than what you really want. But if you're not quite sure about what the market is, maybe you're interviewing for a job in a different geographic market, then try to get the other side to say the number first, but keep in mind that they're doing the same thing. They're trying to set an anchor that's slightly lower than what they're maybe willing to pay. So anchoring bias is really important. It could affect how much money you make for the rest of your life. The second bias that I want to talk about is the confirmation bias. And this is what happens when people tend to interpret new information in the way that's similar with their existing beliefs. So take a moment, everyone, just to think to yourself about the last article that you read because someone you're friends with on social media posted it. You don't have to talk to your neighbor about it, but just keep that in the back of your mind. And I want to share with you something that I found last year. So during the US election, the Wall Street Journal did this interactive media project where they sort of modeled out what a Facebook newsfeed looks like for someone who identifies politically as liberal and someone who identifies politically as conservative. So for the same topic, you can see that there's posts that present this topic in very different ways, right? And so I think what this is trying to show us is that as we're able to choose the subscriptions or the media outlets that we want to subscribe to or get more alerts from, it's really easy to get new information in a way that's consistent with our existing beliefs. So I would challenge all of you, if you haven't sort of thought about this a little bit already, try to think about what that implication is and how you might be able to sort of peek to see some of what the other side is seeing. Some other examples of confirmation bias actually are related to things that happen in the workplace. So one of the reasons why organizational psychologists have done a lot of research on the importance of diversity in the workplace is because diverse voices are able to interpret new information differently. And so we're all working in technology organizations, hopefully working on a lot of interdisciplinary teams. And if you have people who are coming from different academic backgrounds, different regions of the country, or potentially other areas of the world, you have very diverse backgrounds. And hopefully, these different academic frameworks that people are coming from and different experiences that people are coming from help a team be able to interpret that new information differently. In addition, when you are part of a team and you are interviewing candidates, I don't know about you, but at least on my team, it is often very tempting to ask your teammate what they think, right? Especially if you're about to interview someone right after them, you kind of want to catch them in the hallway and ask, oh, what did you think? But even if you don't think that this affects you, subconsciously, it often does. So say your colleague says the candidate was really great, you might be less likely to judge them harshly. Say your colleague says that the candidate was not as impressive as they thought they would be, you might be more critical of the candidate. So as you're designing a lot of these different hiring processes, I would encourage you to try to figure out how you can mitigate confirmation bias. At what points in the process is that potentially going to come up? So confirmation bias, again, it matters because it helps teams make decisions and it impacts the way that ideas are brought to life. It also has an impact on the way that you're able to hire diverse teams, and as a consequence of that, have the people in the room to make those decisions. So one thing that I would say, and this is sort of from the field that I come from, user experience, is that sometimes it's really easy for breakthrough ideas to get killed too early. And that's because everyone on the team has different skill sets. Some people might be really good at communicating their ideas in a visual way. Other people are much more comfortable expressing their idea verbally. And one thing that we like to do, if we're running a design sprint and we're sketching out different ideas, sometimes this is very tactical, but we'll do a sketching exercise where everyone gets a piece of paper and you have some amount of time to sketch an idea on it. You can either draw it, or you can express it with words, or you can storyboard it. And then when the time is up, we actually take our piece of paper and we rotate it to the person next to us, and then they're sort of building upon our idea or reacting to it in addition to sketching a new idea. And then sort of by the end of doing this a couple more times, we present it back out to the team. And sometimes you end up presenting ideas that you didn't even draw. So one, it forces you to be able to communicate your idea in many different ways. And two, it really clarifies the ability for someone to be able to speak to something and try to understand something. And you can try to test if something is intuitive enough to be communicated at that wireframe level pretty early on. And it makes sure that some of those breakthrough ideas don't get killed too early because someone didn't want to present their idea verbally, so their idea ends up being presented by someone else who is pretty great at that, or someone who leans towards communicating something visually or doesn't sort of have that skill set is able to get someone else on the team who has that skill set to sort of react to something. And so that's something you can do to make sure that some of those ideas don't get killed too early. You can brainstorm individually before you come together as a team. And when you're making some of those hiring decisions, if you're designing the hiring process, you could aim to go for blind resume reviews. For some organizations, this might not be possible given the applicant tracking software system that you use. So if that isn't possible, you can try to build out a process where you're holding certain scores and notes so that other interviews don't have a chance to view them before they have to submit their own. I know I was in a situation because I was at a startup where for a while I accidentally had more permissions than I was supposed to, and I was reading all these notes that I actually shouldn't have been able to see. So if you're working in a very quickly moving organization, spending time thinking about that is actually really important because these are people that are bringing into you're bringing into your company to make these future decisions. So the last psychological phenomenon that I want to talk about is social proof. And you probably are familiar with this concept more or less, but this is essentially what happens when you see other people behaving a certain way, you assume it to be correct, and you want to mimic it. So you assume that the actions of others are true, and you want to reflect that correct behavior. So a fun example of this is canned laughter in sitcoms. So I think maybe it was in the 80s or 90s, it was very common to use canned laughter in sitcoms. And the reason for this, they hypothesize, is that if the show told you when to laugh, then you would be more likely to laugh. And there was actually a study that was done, it's in a book called Influence, where they tried to test the implication or what people thought about canned laughter. And in this study, they found out that people thought that canned laughter was really cheesy, really tacky. But when they asked people to rate the perceived funniness of different shows, they actually found the shows that had canned laughter to be more funny than ones that didn't. And so part of it also might be because of the period of time that this was popular. It's possible that because so many shows had that impacted the way that people thought about the perceived funniness of shows. I don't know if this research has been replicated so that it might be still true today when canned laughter isn't as common in situational comedies. But this really demonstrates that while we think that we are immune to these different biases, they actually do affect us subconsciously. We make judgments based on them. And I think one implication that this sort of canned laughter research has for our work in the field of user experience or digital products in general is when we conduct user research. And I spoke to this a little bit earlier today, but sometimes when we conduct user research, users kind of guess that we're talking to a couple of other users, and we ask them a question, and they really want to know, well, what did other users say? Or we ask them a question, and we ask them for feedback, whether it's positive or negative, and they really want to mostly give positive feedback because that's what they feel like they should be doing. They feel like other users might only be saying good things, so they feel like they should too. And I would say that if you're conducting user research and you see some of this social proof coming up when you're interacting with users, try to think of creative ways to mitigate it. For example, just don't tell them what other users have said, or maybe wait till the end if they really, really want to know, and just ask to make sure to hold that towards the end. Another example of social proof is actually also, again, in the context of interviewing and hiring. So there's something called the halo effect, and it's an example of social proof. It's essentially when someone on their resume, they have a very desirable employer or a very prestigious university. It means that when you're reviewing resumes like that, you might be more likely to make some of those cognitive shortcuts and assume, oh, well, if this company wanted them or if this university selected them, then they might be great. And it might subconsciously make you less likely to ask them harder questions in their interview because you've already made some judgments. This also goes both ways. So if someone has a gap in their resume, it might be easy to subconsciously make a judgment about them. Maybe they were unemployed. But in some cases, it could just be that they were taking care of a family member who was sick, or something else that really has nothing to do with the quality of their work. So the halo effect is real, and I would say that as you're designing your hiring process, try to think about ways in which this might come up in your interview process and figure out if you can design around that so it doesn't happen. And the last example I'll give comes again in the context of pricing. So this is a screenshot of the former pricing page for project management software called Basecamp. And the one thing I'll say about this is that for someone who doesn't give a lot of thought into what project management software they might use, so someone who doesn't, their job isn't to manage like an agile workflow, this is actually really helpful because there's 4 different options. They tell you the difference between all of these options, but if you're subscribing to a project management software for the first time and you really don't know what the difference between all these gigabytes of storage is, maybe you don't work in the field of technology, you just want to choose something that you think makes the most sense for you. And if you're not really sure what makes the most sense, it helps to know which one is just the most popular. You can go with that and then scale up or down as you need to. So they've highlighted here the most popular plan, and this is really helpful for someone to make a decision when they have too many options because it just tells you what other people have chosen, and if you're too lazy to figure out the difference between these plans, you can just go with that. So social proof matters a lot because it impacts the way that we conduct user research, it impacts the way that we interview people, and it also has an impact on the way that we decide to go to market. So some key takeaways here is that if someone asks you what users have said so far, try to avoid answering that question or make sure to hold it towards the end. If you're interviewing a candidate and you're jumping to some conclusions, maybe make sure that you're avoiding making those assumptions and just ask if you have a question about a gap in their resume or if you have a question about what role in a specific large company that they worked on. And if you're launching a new product and you have a couple different pricing options that you want to test because you want to look for that anchoring bias research, then you could also consider highlighting one of those options to make that decision-making process easier. So today we talked about 3 different biases: the anchoring bias, the confirmation bias, and social proof. We thought about the impact of these biases on our everyday life and some key takeaways when it comes to pricing and bringing our product to market, when it comes to interviewing people and hiring them onto our teams, and then also maybe interviewing as a candidate yourself. And we also thought about the impact of this on user research. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Una gran charla. Me imagino que habrán preguntas del público. Por favor, alcen su mano. Aquí tenemos la primera.
Perfect. Nice.
Hola, acá. Felicitaciones por la presentación nuevamente. Una pregunta, en el último punto que tocaste, que era... lo anoté por acá. Social proof.
Sure.
Yo trabajo en experiencia de usuario y siempre me pasa cada vez que testeo con usuario, test de usabilidad, por ejemplo, me pasa que en el test, post-test, porque un test de usabilidad uno no puede hablar entre medio, pero post-test dan ciertas afirmaciones o al parecer tratan de contestar, siempre tratando de decir que el producto es bueno o que logra los objetivos, etc. Pero, sin embargo, cuando uno mide eso en el producto como salido a producción, sea lo que sea, una web, un e-commerce, da lo mismo,
the product itself, the data will differ from those comments from the users that were tested. Like if I'm doing a user test with 2 options, we will see maybe that the A product is winning among the users, but in the actual product test, it's the B product, the one that beats the other. So how do you actually realize what's the objective, the impartial result?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a couple thoughts here. So in general, the way that we try to make decisions using data, we typically use the quantitative data, the usage analytics, the behavior to look at what people actually do. And then we'll follow up with qualitative research where we're interviewing people and asking them why a lot to figure out why they behaved a certain way. Sometimes it's reactive, so we look at something that in the usage data and we notice something that is inconsistent with what we thought to be true, and then we actually try to find those specific people and uncover the why behind why they're behaving in a certain way. Other times when we're designing a new feature, for example, it's more focused on the qualitative research first, and then using the quantitative analytics for if we're running a beta testing program when we have the analytics and tracking set up for that. So I think that the first thing I would say is just that if you're thinking about what kind of question you want to ask, if your question is a why question, go with the qualitative first. If your question is a what question, go with the quantitative data first. And then sometimes I think that it depends on what kind of product your product is. So the company that I work for, it's primarily like a B2B product. So we tend to rely probably a little bit more heavily on the qualitative research than the quantitative research because we don't have millions of users like a social media site, right? But I think that if you're seeing that discrepancy in your behavior, but you work on a product that actually has a lot of users, it could be that your qualitative research is coming from a sample of users that's not representative of your overall user base, in which case I would work with thinking not only at the human-centered design research level, but also at the market research level, making sure that you're segmenting out your market and you're trying to find a representative user for different segments of that market. Because that could be what's happening, where if that happens pretty consistently, you might be relying too heavily on one segment of the market for the qualitative research, but your analytics, which show your overall market, they're saying a different story. So it might be a little bit of selection bias at play.
Una pregunta más.
Hi, Crystal. Great presentation. When you're doing qualitative research, do you ever carry out that research within the dependencies of your business or company? Do you always choose to go outside of the office to carry out more structured qualitative research?
Yeah.
And why?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So typically when we're doing it depends on the type of research we're doing. So if we're doing what we call internally a prototype test, where we have a prototype of something that we might build, but it hasn't actually been built yet by anyone on an engineering team, we almost always try to meet them at their office because we learn so much from being able to see their work environment. So one thing that we saw pretty consistently with almost all of our users is that in their office, every single one of them has a printed map of the United States, and they color code it based on how many bills that they have in that state and what status it is. And if we were inviting them into our office, we never would have been able to see that. And they do this even though they have the digital version of that within our product. It's just because they want to be able to customize it a little bit more. And we saw every single one of our users do that, and it helped inform some of the decisions we made to improve that area of our digital experience. Another thing that I will say is that when it comes to doing like structured usability testing, where we're testing something that already exists in the product and we have a defined list of tasks that we want to test, sometimes we end up doing it in our office, mostly just for the ease of logistics. So that way we can book one conference room to test with the user, and it's kind of a smaller room and it feels a little less intimidating. And then we book a larger conference room that is the observation room, and we connect the two rooms through like a conference call screen sharing service. And we invite everyone in the company. Our company's pretty small, it's like 150 people. And then when we first started doing this, it was less than that, maybe 50 people. We invite everyone in the company to actually sit in and observe that. And it's because it's part of our like user UX principles to invite people to be a part of seeing that research and seeing how our users experience things. So it depends, but if we have the option to go to their office, we typically try to do that. And we're lucky that a good portion of our users are in the same city that we are in, and then maybe that's probably a little over half, they're in Washington, DC, and then the other about half are spread out throughout the country. So sometimes if our client success team is going to some of those nearby cities to do like quarterly business review meetings, someone from our product team will sort of tag along, and we make a brief session on the UX research part of the agenda, but distinctly separate from the executive review, like upsell kind of conversation.